Yeah, so there's lots of considerations when using AI, one being IP protection. So understanding where the information that's being collected is coming from. So the information that you're using to train your AI model, understanding just, exactly the origins of that, the sources of that data, and whether you're allowed to have that information and whether you're allowed to use it in the way that you plan to use it. Data privacy. So, Daniel and I will talk a bit more about that in coming slides. But essentially, anytime an AI model uses personal information, you definitely need to make sure that the processing of that personal information from the time that you collect it until the time that the model makes its outputs and then the business acts upon those outputs, through that whole process, that whole life cycle, you want to make sure that you're complying with relevant privacy legislation. So one of the good ways to mitigate some of these risks is by incorporating your AI practices right into your existing privacy management program. Also, you'd want to make sure that any different types of data that you're using is appropriately protected. So whether it's sensitive personal information or confidential business information. So for instance, if you're using third-party AI model, it's just about understanding how the information you input into the model is being used and then possibly retained. Accuracy is another big consideration. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but sometimes models, which are based on predictive text completion, they may produce an output that sounds reasonable, but it should always be verified for accuracy, particularly where the sources of training data are unknown to the user. And then you need to consider both emerging legislation, such as AI specific legislation. There's data protection legislation, but there's other types of laws as well. For instance, copyright law that may be relevant to the type of processing that your AI model does and what you do with that information.
Dave, from your perspective, what are you seeing, in terms of things companies should be considering?
I mean, with most or maybe all of these, there are examples that we can point to where something did go wrong, and so we should all learn the lesson from others. I mean, whether it's the attorney filing a brief with cases that are don't exist and were based on hallucinations, or and not this didn't involve AI, but or like the FTC ordering that as part of a settlement agreement that an algorithm be destroyed because the algorithm was developed with personal data that was not collected in a way where the person gave consent for the data to be used to train that algorithm. So we should certainly learn from, and a lot of these are exactly that, sort of takeaways from the ways that others have learned the hard way.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point too, Dave, in terms of, understanding the obligations that are associated with the data that's being used to train the model. Because the data protection laws still apply, especially if you're needing to use personal information to train the model. And I think that is a key risk and consideration that companies need to factor in as they're looking to deploy AI in their solutions. What type of data is being used to train it? So there's a lot to consider when developing or deploying AI.